So I wasn't originally planning on doing a video for this movie, but The Lost City just came out, and while I haven't seen it, what I know about it is that it has a very strong resemblance to this movie. So I want to take this opportunity and talk about a somewhat underrated Robert Zemeckis classic. Romancing the Stone. So Romancing the Stone is a jungle adventure type movie directed by Robert Zemeckis, you know, the guy who did Roger Rabbit and Back to the Future. Before all those movies, he did Romancing the Stone. This was not his first movie, but it was the movie that got him the recognition and the box office success to get the funding and get Steven Spielberg's attention to go ahead with Back to the Future, which was the one that really kicked off his success as a director. And I gotta say, I really like this movie. And I always feel like I'm overhyping it whenever I talk about it, but there is something about this movie that I just can't get enough of. And I think part of that is the kind of tongue-in-cheek nature of this movie. The title alone, I would put in the Princess Bride category of misleading titles. A title that you hear it and you immediately think like, oh, this is just going to be a sappy, cheap, probably not that good chick flick, but in reality is actually a pretty awesome adventure story. And maybe I'm the only one that thought that, but watching the movie just now, I think it's a good title for the movie because it encapsulates the kind of tongue-in-cheek take on the trashy romance novel adventure story. You know, the kind you get for like $3 with Fabio on the cover. This movie is ultimately a parody of that kind of story, while at the same time being an actual legitimately good action adventure story. And that's what I love about this movie, is that it does both things very well. You can watch it as just a straightforward, kind of cheesy popcorn flick action adventure story, or you can look at it as kind of a tongue-in-cheek parody of that kind of romance novel. Either way is valid, and for those of you who say, oh, it's just a Raiders of the Lost Ark knockoff, you know, it's nothing that unique or special, to that I say, okay, well, Raiders was also inspired by kind of pulpy stories, and Raiders came out only a couple years before Romancing the Stone. They both have very different tones, and Romancing the Stone is much more lighthearted and tongue-in-cheek than Raiders was, so I think that warrants it having its own place in the action-adventure genre. But what is the story of Romancing the Stone, really? Well, you've got Kathleen Turner as author Joan Wilder, and I use author kind of loosely because she exclusively writes those trashy romance novels that I talked about earlier. And she's doing her thing, you know, writing epic love stories and crying over her typewriter. That is until her sister gets kidnapped in Colombia and now she has to go and try to get her back. And her only bargaining chip is this map that can lead the bad guys to some ancient treasure that's buried somewhere. I'm starting to realize maybe The Last Crusade ripped this movie off more than this ripped Raiders of the Lost Ark off. You know, a relative mails the main character a map and now they have to go and rescue the relative. It's pretty close. But anyway, now she's in Colombia and she is way out of her element. She doesn't speak Spanish and she is being a slightly less annoying Willie Scott about it until her bus crashes into a car and she's stranded in the middle of the jungle with a guy she just met, played by Michael Douglas. And Douglas plays your typical rugged adventurer Jack Colton. And the way these two meet is straight out of one of those pulpy romance novels, because when the bus breaks down, she gets off the bus and she's held at gunpoint by Dr. Zolo, who we don't really know who he is or what he's about. He's just kind of this dark, shadowy figure, you know. You know he's the bad guy because he's got those sunken eyes and he always is in the shadows, and, you know, he just kind of looks like a bad guy. You know, this movie's not the most subtle with its depictions of heroes and villains. But anyway, Zolo has her at gunpoint, and then Jack kind of comes out of the bush and fires a couple shotgun blasts, saving her life. And now it's just the two of them. It's Jack and Joan. They're in the jungle, and it starts to rain, and they get soaked, and she's being all irritable about it because this is not her element whatsoever. And Jack doesn't really want to be with her, but she needs a guy to get back to civilization. So he actually charges her $375 to take her back to the nearest phone, which is kind of cool because it subverts the whole, you know, romantic idea of, oh, he sees her and he falls in love immediately and there's a connection there, and now all of a sudden he's this selfless romantic guy. That is not the case. Jack Colton's been barely scraping by in the jungle for quite some time, so it's going to take a little bit for his hard heart to soften. But it's here where I want to talk about Kathleen Turner as Joan Wilder, because I already kind of compared her to Willie Scott in Temple of Doom, And I'm not the biggest fan of Willie Scott. I think she's very annoying. But for some reason, while Kathleen Turner is the same type of character, you know, the kind of damsel in distress, the fish out of water, she has no clue how to survive in this jungle environment and kind of makes a fool of herself quite a bit. But the biggest difference between the two is that Joan Wilder actually progresses as a character as the movie goes along. With every encounter, yes, she makes mistakes and she does dumb things because she doesn't know any better. But she always learns and doesn't make those mistakes a second time. And by the end of the movie, she has developed some serious survival skills to the point where she goes hand-to-hand combat with Zola. Now, she doesn't really win in that altercation, and nor should she, because she hasn't had that much practice in combat. But it does show how much her character has progressed, where she's no longer fleeing danger, she's now jumping into the danger trying to protect her sister. But just focusing in on the middle section of this movie, it's a lot of fun. You have a bunch of different set pieces and scenarios where they have to escape the bad guys, because you have your two leads and they're kind of bickering back and forth. There's a lot of really good back and forth, and both characters have a lot to contribute in the relationship. It's really cool to see it progress, and it culminates in a somewhat romantic scene when they're in the ruined remains of a drug smuggling plane. And this is their first real opportunity to bond over some alcohol and a pot fire. Yeah, I guess it took the combination of alcohol and the marijuana bonfire for Jack to finally start opening up about his feelings. And all things considered, it's a pretty cute scene. You know, Jack talks about how he wants to live on a boat and travel the world if he had the money, and how he's been kind of stranded here for the past couple decades. And then Joan brings up the map and how it's her only chance to save her sister. And they get to talking about that, and then Jack gets the idea like, wait, if we were to actually go and find the Corazon, this heart emerald, well, then they'd have some actual bargaining power. The map is only the halfway point so that they can find the emerald, but if they just bring the emerald to the bad guy, well, that gives them a little more power. And he says this, and it does make some sense, but really, you know and I know that he just wants to take the emerald for himself, that's his ticket off this country so that he can sail the world on his boat. And while this looks like the setup for a traditional liar revealed story where she finds out at the worst possible time and then they split up and they mope only to come back together at the end, this movie kind of breezes right past that. Yes, there is a scene where she questions him and she's like, oh, you're only doing this for yourself, and Danny DeVito's character kind of tells her at the wrong time, but they handle it like real people would handle. You know, they confront each other, they have a verbal disagreement, and then they kind of move on with their life. They resolve it. They don't just split up and isolate themselves like so many movies do. And speaking of Danny DeVito, let's talk about the villains in this movie, because it has 3 of them, and they may be my favorite part of the movie. I already kind of talked about Zolo, and he's kind of the enigma of the 3. He's kind of on his own. He's got his own private army, and he's kind of in charge of the police, but it's kind of corrupt. So you don't really know where he stands. He just is there as kind of the wild card. You know, he throws a wrench into any situation. But the 2 main antagonists in this movie is Ira, played by Zach Norman, and Ralph, played by Danny DeVito. And these 2 guys, they're brothers. They kidnapped Joan's sister, and they want that map to the emerald. That's all they want. They just want that emerald and the money, and they'll do really anything they want to get that. And while you may think that just makes them kind of cheesy Saturday morning cartoon villains, you're absolutely right. They are Saturday morning cartoon villains. And I think if you look at it through that lens, because again, this whole movie is framed around the concept of cheesy, pulpy romance novels, this movie gets a lot funnier and a lot more enjoyable, because both actors are just chewing the scenery in every scene they're in. Ira is kind of the brains of the organization, and he kind of looks like a stretched out Mario, and his lair, which is actually an abandoned military fort, so yeah, complete with actual castle fort if this wasn't cartoony enough. But on top of that, he's also got a pit full of crocodiles, which leads to the best catchphrase in this movie. Oh, look at those snappers. I don't know why, but that line just cracks me up. It's so hilarious. He says it over and over again. They really tried to hammer in home that was his catchphrase. He says it so many times, and I kind of love it for that. But let's not forget Ralph, played by Danny DeVito. And I'm not the biggest Danny DeVito fan. I think the only reason he gets a lot of his roles is because he's short and fat and angry, and if you're gonna cast an actor that's short and fat and angry, cast Joe Pesci instead. I think any role that Danny DeVito has done, Joe Pesci could have done it better. This movie being a notable exception. This is the one movie where I don't think Joe Pesci could have done it better, and it all comes down to this one line delivery.
If they're hiking through the jungle, there's nothing I can do about it. I have a car. I am not Tarzan.
The way he says Tarzan is just hilarious to me. And I don't think Joe Pesci could have done that any better. But as for the rest of his performance, I legitimately think that Danny DeVito's kind of stunted rage really works here in that kind of cartoony, over-the-top kind of way. Because his overacting weirdly matches Ira's overacting. And it's just a lot of fun when the two interact together. And really when they interact with anybody, because it's always funny. But now I'm going to skip ahead to the climax of this movie, because this is where the movie gets pretty awesome. It gets a bit more serious and a bit more intense, but it still never loses the fun campiness that we've enjoyed throughout the rest of the movie. But it's here where Joan Wilder is invited into this fort, you know, the headquarters of the bad guys. And it's here where they're going to do the exchange. She's going to give them the map, and they're going to give her sister back. And everything's going smooth, and it even looks like they may have pulled a fast one on the bad guys, because her and Jack had already found the diamond, but then they got separated by a waterfall. So now she just has to go with the map and hope that they don't find out that they actually have both. And it seems to be going well until Jack shows up, because he got captured, and they're like, okay, where's the diamond? And she doesn't really know. She doesn't know what Jack did with it, but regardless, they think she does know, and they cut her hand open with a knife. You know, there's blood, and this is really the first instance of blood in this movie. Yeah, there's been some shootouts, there's been some chase sequences and some action, but we really haven't seen blood in this movie until the climax. The first instance of this is when they cut open her hand with a knife and dangle it over the crocodile pit, asking her where the stone is, and then she looks to Jack, and Jack's like, stop, I know where it is, but then he doesn't really want to tell them where it is, because he's like, it's in a safe place. And then we find out that it was in his pants. He does a little shimmy, and it falls down his pant leg onto his boot. And he's like, catch, and he kicks it, and it looks like it's going to be going in the water, but then Zolo, who is there, he's the one that kind of ratted everybody out, and he wants the diamond for himself. So that's how that came back around. And he reaches out and catches it just in the nick of time. But before he can really celebrate, a crocodile comes up out of the water and bites his hand right off, with all the blood and gore and tearing flesh that 80s PG can deliver. Man, I miss 80s PG. Can we bring it back? And funny enough, the first time I saw this movie, I was, a kid, and I thought this was some weird reinterpretation of the origin story of Captain Hook. Yeah, I was a weird kid. But I don't know, it's the jungle, the bad guy loses a hand to a crocodile, the crocodile eats it, and it was even his left hand too, the same as Captain Hook. So I don't know, for me the connection was just too strong to ignore. But right after that, guns start firing, and we have another exciting shootout action scene, and people are ducking for cover, and there's fist fights. And in another clever subversion of the classic romance novel tropes, Jack is not fighting for Joan or her sister and their honor or lives. He's off wrestling that crocodile that just ate the gem in his hand, because that's what's important, clearly. But of course, there is a moment where Jack actually has to make a decision. Does he rescue Joan or does he get the gem? And of course, he rescues Joan. He saves the day. And Zola falls into the crocodile pit so that, the rest of them can be eaten, because, again, Captain Hook. And while it seems like Ira escaped on a boat in time and isn't going to get caught, Ralph isn't going to be so lucky. And again, that's kind of funny that his brother just straight up abandoned him, while at the same time he's yelling at him saying like, no, I'll bring a boat around, I'll come right back, I'll send another boat, don't worry about it. And he has absolutely no intention of coming back, and by the time anything does come back, Ralph will be halfway to a Colombian prison, so that's not gonna help him either. And just to wrap things up real quick, our romantic leads have a very passionate and romantic kiss right before he straight up abandons her and jumps into the water, presumably after that crocodile, and she returns safely back to New York with her sister, where she whips out a new book in record time based on her adventure in Colombia, what we just saw in this movie, just with a little happier ending. The guy doesn't straight up abandon her, he actually leaves and then meets her at the airport, and it's romantic and it's sweet, and they live happily ever after, the end. But before you know it, she goes outside and sees the boat, this big boat in the middle of the street in New York, and she's like, well, what's that doing there? But then Jack comes out and he's rocking these new alligator boots, and I bet you can guess where those came from, and then I guess you can figure out where the money for the boat came from. And yes, Jack did in fact come back for her, and they're gonna go and tour the world together on their boat, and they're gonna live happily ever after. And that's Romancing the Stone. Is it cheesy? Yes. Is it derivative of other movies and genres? Yes, but at the end of the day, I still really love this movie because it is a well-executed example of a fresh take on the adventure story. For all the things in this movie that might remind you of other things, there's also some really original concepts and writing and execution and subversion of tropes and comedy. It's a movie that you can watch again and again. You can find new hidden details and jokes and references to romance novels and the meta story that's being told. And that's because this movie, like a lot of Robert Zemeckis' best work, gives you a lot of information visually and doesn't waste time too much with exposition. It'll just show you Michael Douglas caressing the picture of a boat, and immediately that tells you, yeah, he wants a boat, he wants to go on the water, he's obsessed with it, he wants to leave the jungle, and before you know it, you're invested. And there's so many examples of that throughout the movie that this world just feels a lot more lived in and real, even though it is this fun, adventurous, heightened reality. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Romancing the Stone? It's not really a movie that's talked about nearly as much as I think it should be. So whatever you think, let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.